Good morning again. Boy, it seems like already, I'm up here already again. Doesn't it seem like really quick today? We're moving right along. Efficiency, that's what we're all about. Not really, anyway. Well, I want to talk to you about something interesting today. We're going to take a little break. We're going to just take 1 week break. I promise this is 1 week from Pastor Doug is talking about fasting, and I want to take a 1 week break from that. But I'm going to be talking about something that we've been talking about all year so far. But let me tell you where this came from today, because I feel like it's necessary to tell you this, that what I'm going to talk to you about today came from the fact that I saw a video, okay? I saw a video, and then somehow or another that led me to looking up a word. I'll explain this to you, I promise. And so that led to a definition that you're going to hear today. And that's really what we're talking about. Now, I know when I say that out loud, that sounds really boring. I realized when I just said that now. That sounds like, wow, oh, that sounds exciting. You're going to talk us about definitions. Fantastic. But stick with me. I think it'll be worthwhile. Now, like I said, we've really been talking about all year, haven't we, about being intentional about our faith, about being purposeful in our walk with Christ. And so this really is piggybacking on that and really talking about that same thing. Even Pastor Doug's sermon series about fasting, it really is about the same thing, and that is being intentional about our faith. And so that's what I want to talk about today, more of being intentional about our faith, because I want to talk about being a follower of Christ. I want to talk about following Christ purposefully in our life. And when I hear that word follower, I think, what does a follower of Christ look like? What does that really mean to be a follower of Christ? And my first thought when I thought of that was, well, it really kind of means everything, doesn't it? We're all different and we're all separate individuals, so we all are followers of Christ in different ways. In certain situations and certain times, it's different for all of us. That was my first thought. And then I started thinking, maybe that's not exactly right. Maybe we are a little more, or should be a little more in line with each other and a little more uniform. And so that's what I want to talk about, this idea of following Christ and being a little more uniform with that. But before we go there, I don't want you to get hung up on the word follow. Because in this day and age, I think that word follow has a little bit of a negative connotation. I don't think it is necessarily the word that we like to hear. Is it a bad thing today? Because I have never heard, please raise your hand if you have heard somebody say this. I have never heard somebody who is either just going to have a child or has just had children. I've never heard them say, I am going to raise my child to be a follower. Does anybody say that? I've never heard anybody say that. It doesn't sound quite right on our ears. We talk about teaching our kids to be leaders, to be individuals. And that's also, isn't it, in this day and age, this idea of following is frowned upon, because what is society teaching us now? What is the message that we are bombarded with constantly, whether it be through commercials or movies or on TV or in advertisements? The message that we're being bombarded with, I believe, is that we have to be different. You should be different. You should be stepping out. You should be making your own mark in the world. You should be different than everybody else. That being the same is old and boring and ick. Who cares? Who wants to do that? Now, I have a couple problems with that. Before I go on, I do have a couple problems with that. First of all, this idea about not being a follower, well, by definition, think about this, there's more followers than leaders. So the chances are most of us are following, at least in some regard, okay? The second thing about being different, have you ever seen a time, I don't think there's ever been a time where things have been more undifferent than they are right now in many ways. We talk about diversity and we talk about being different, but think of this. If you went to a town that's essentially the same size as Palmyra, go to that town in Pennsylvania, go to that town in Montana, go to that town in Arizona, I guarantee it's going to look almost exactly the same. The weather might be a little bit different, and you might hear a little bit of a different dialect, but the fact of the matter is they're going to have a Walmart, there's going to be a McDonald's, there's going to be the same basic stores and services that we have here. That's all I'm saying. Enough of that, though. But this idea of following Christ, of following somebody, this idea that it's a bad idea to us, here is the problem with that from a scriptural standpoint. The problem is, Scripture, Matthew 4:19, come follow me, Jesus said. This is when he first goes to and starts calling his disciples. He's calling his disciples. He's calling us. And he's saying, follow me. He's telling us, be a follower. Follow in my footsteps. Jesus isn't calling us to lead him, to be out in front of Jesus. He's calling us to be his follower. So here we have society telling us, don't be a follower, be a leader at all costs. And then Jesus comes along in Scripture and says, come and follow me. And it puts us in this position where it's like, wow, that's going against what society teaches us. It goes against what I've always been taught to be a leader. Jesus is coming here saying, follow me. And here's the way my weird mind thinks. When I saw that, I saw come follow me, and that word follow kept bothering me. So I actually went and looked it up. Here's the definition part. I actually went and looked it up, but not in English. I know what it means. I see what you're like, you don't know what follow means? Wow, that's sad. No, I actually know what the word follow means, but I looked it up in the original Greek that it was written in. And here is the word in Greek that is in the New Testament, is mimetes. Okay? I'd never heard of it before, but there it is. It's mimetes, and it is used 7 different times in the New Testament. And in our main scripture in Ephesians that you're going to see here in a few minutes, it's used today as well. That word mimetes is used. And it's translated most often as follow. But when you look it up in the Greek dictionaries, Greek to English, really follow there's 2 primary definitions, but follow is really kind of the second one. There's actually another word that is used instead of follow. And that is the word, can you see it in there, mimetes? Mimic, imitate. Now that may sound very subtle to you at the beginning, but think about this. If Scripture is telling us to follow Jesus, and what it's really saying is imitate Jesus, there's so much more to that, isn't there? It's not just putting your head down and kind of following along in Jesus' footsteps, not really paying attention to what you're doing or where you're going. Imitating Jesus is so much more. It is doing what he does. It is saying what he says. It is treating people like he treats people. This idea of following Jesus, maybe what it really means is to imitate Jesus. And I like to think of it as that's exactly what it's saying. To mimic Jesus, to imitate him, because again, it's so much more than just that word follow. In other words, instead of being followers of Christ, maybe what we need to start doing is looking at as being imitators of Christ. Now, the best analogy that I could think of for this, the best thing that I was able to come up with, and I think it follows through, it carries through on a number of different levels, is this idea of a parent to a child. And God is kind of the same way to us. This parent and child analogy kind of carries through because we know, don't we, that when we accept Christ in our life, that we become adopted into God's family. We literally become a child of God. And we, as parents, it's kind of the same thing. We feel for our kids this unconditional love, this feeling that we have to teach them and help them grow. And God, I'm positive, has the same relationship with us. Now, there's one big difference, isn't there, is the fact that we are human beings as parents and we make mistakes. where God is the creator of the universe, the King of kings, the Lord of lords, perfect in every way. So a little bit of a better person to imitate, I would say. But think about that. Joyce and I have this wonderful experience where we have a niece and a nephew, and they both are married and having kids. They've been having kids for a number of years now, and they, between them, they have 5 kids, all boys, all under the age of, 7, Joyce? 6? Under the age of 6. 5 boys, all under the age of 6. And we go on vacation with them. And you may question whether it's really a relaxing vacation. But one of the things we get to see, and it's fascinating to watch, is, of course, these kids learn from what their parents tell them. But what we get to stand back and see is you see how much they learn by imitating their parents. It is a fascinating process to watch, and it's easier to see when you're not the parent. Now, when you are the parent, we've had this experience, I'm sure you've all had this experience, haven't you? Where you are the parent and your child starts to imitate you. Now, in a positive sense, you sit there and it's a very proud moment to say, look at that. My child thinks so highly of me and is following me that closely that they are imitating me. They are saying what I say or doing what I do. But there's no greater horror, is there, than when you're standing there and you hear something come out of your child's mouth and all you hear is yourself. And you go, oh my word, that's me. That's something that I would say. How can I get angry at my child for that when they've heard it from me? I'm the one who has said that or done that. And so kids learn from imitating. And they learn and they grow and they mature physically by imitating us. We can say all kinds of things to our kids, but it's really our actions, isn't it, that really teach them. It teaches them in so many ways. And so I look at this analogy as that it follows through that we are like that. We are like children when it comes to our spirituality. We are immature, and for us to grow and for us to mature, we need to imitate God. We need to imitate Christ in our life, to do what He does, to say what He says. Not just follow, but imitate. And lest you think that I'm the only one thinking this way, let me show you our main scripture today from Ephesians. And this is what Ephesians says. It says, this is chapter 5. It says, follow God's example, therefore. And by the way, that word follow is one of the times in the New Testament where it's memetes. Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave Himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Now, my version of the NIV is an older version than this, and my version of the NIV actually specifically says, imitate Christ, therefore, as dearly loved children. Imitate Christ. That's what it's saying. So Paul is telling the Ephesians, Paul is telling us, the way for you to grow in the faith is to follow Christ, but to imitate Him, to mimic Christ and what He says and what He does as dearly loved children. You see this metaphor, this idea of a child and growing in the faith. It is there in Paul's letter to the Ephesians. So following Christ, I would put to you, really means imitating Christ, which, as I explained, is so much more than just putting your head down and following Him. And if you want to see an example of this, look at the disciples. Look at the disciples. When Jesus calls them, and we heard in Matthew when He says, come, follow me, and they start following Him, and He says, come and imitate me, and they come and they start imitating Him. We see the disciples sometimes in scriptures, especially early on, don't we? And we go, what is wrong with these guys? Why can't they figure out what is going on? But the reason is because they are spiritually immature at the time. He picks complete spiritual novices. They don't know anything. He chooses them. And he says, follow me, meaning imitate me. And that's how they learn, by watching Jesus, by imitating what he says and what he does. And isn't it the same way for us? That we grow in our spiritual maturity by imitating Christ. Because don't we see from the disciples, by the time Jesus then finally leaves them, they are in a position of being spiritually mature and being able to really mimic Christ, to say what he was saying. Do you know, if you go back and look at this, I'm not making this up, go back and read in some of the early criticisms of the church, the early church, was that the people leading the church, people like the disciples, had no mind of their own. That they were just, you don't have no mind, you have no mind of your own. You're just doing this, you're just imitating Christ. You're just saying what he said. You're just doing what he did. And that was meant as a criticism, but I would think as a leader at that point in time in the church, they would take that as a compliment. How great is that? Which leads us to one more point. And let me use the scripture from 1 Corinthians to make this point. 1 Corinthians 11:1 says, and this is Paul writing to the Corinthians, he says, follow my example. Now this is another one of the times where that mimetes is used. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. In other words, imitate me as I imitate Christ. So the idea is that we imitate Christ, we grow spiritually, we grow to the point that we are actually starting to act and talk like Christ. And then people can follow us. So it's being a leader, but it's not the kind of leader that we normally think about. It's actually leading by following. Does that make sense? It sounds strange when you first say it, but I hope you understand what I'm saying. That really what you do is you have to follow first, and you have to continue to follow all of your life, and then after you have followed, then others will follow you. You imitate Christ, and so others see you and can imitate you, can follow you. And we're all, of course, following Christ. That's what it means. But Paul is telling them, look, here's an easy example. I do everything in my power to live a life that Christ would lead, to talk to people and to treat people like Christ would. So just watch what I do. Now, of course, Paul would say to you, I'm sure he would say if he were here now, I make mistakes. I'm a human being. You can't just put on the blinders and follow me. You're following Christ. But for some of us, that's a little more difficult because we have to pick up the scripture and we have to read it and we have to put it into our system and then try to do it intentionally. Sometimes it's easier just to see somebody and say, that's the kind of life that I want to lead, because that is the life that reflects Christ. Now, many of you at this point in time, I'm just guessing, could be wrong about this, many of you at this point in time are possibly saying, wait a minute, didn't you at the beginning of this say you were basing this on two things? The definition, okay, we get that. You've pounded that into the ground. We get that. But wasn't there a video you were talking about? You thought I forgot, didn't you? You thought I forgot. I did not forget that. Because I do want to talk about this video that I saw, because I think it is a perfect illustration of what I've been talking about being a follower of Christ, meaning being an imitator of Christ, and what that looks like to be a follower of Christ, and then for others to follow you. Because again, I think the perfect example is our kids. That when we are a follower of Christ, that's what we show our kids, that's what they learn, that's what the example that they follow as well. So they become followers of Christ by being followers of us. And if you think that's a hard thing to do, I will tell you, it's probably not the easiest thing to do, especially in this day and age, and to do it very purposefully and intentionally. It's probably not the easiest thing to do, but it is being done. It's actually being done in this church because that's where this video comes from. It comes from two young women who are in this church, the Alt sisters. They teach third and fourth grade. Yes, Joyce is telling me third and fourth grade. They teach our third and fourth graders in Sunday school. And they made a little video that kind of has to deal with what I've been talking about today. And I think that's the way I want to end this today, because I think it is absolutely the perfect illustration of leading by following. By following Christ, by imitating Christ, and therefore showing it to others and allowing them to follow us. So these are your kids. These are our kids in this church, and their example of what it means to them to follow Christ.
Jealous for me. Love's like a hurricane. I am a tree bending beneath the weight of his wind and mercy. When all of a sudden I am unaware of these afflictions eclipsed by glory, and I realize just how beautiful you are and how great your affections are for me. And oh, how he loves us so. Oh, how he loves us. How he loves us so. Love's like a hurricane.